I am Elish, 22, the invisible daughter in a picture-perfect family. Months ago, a tragic medical emergency changed everything. My parents cared more about their political empire than my shattered collarbone. I never understood why I was the one locked in an isolated hospital room until those emergency x-rays and a hidden digital server revealed the dark extortion ring they desperately tried to hide. The truth always finds a way to surface, even when it is buried under practice smiles and charity galas. Before I share this painful family secret I have kept under lock and key, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that the truth is always worth fighting for. Growing up, my family appeared entirely flawless from the outside, but inside I knew the reality. On a damp evening in late October, the heavy fog of the Pacific Northwest rolled against the glass panels of my greenhouse. This was my sanctuary. Inside these climate-controlled walls, the air was warm, smelling of rich earth and blooming orchids. Away from the main estate, it was quiet. Sitting on the damp concrete floor was Leo, my 10-year-old brother. He was lining up his toy cars in perfectly straight rows, lost in his own peaceful world. Next to him lay Buddy, our golden retriever, resting his heavy head gently on Leo's knee. They were my actual family, not the people inside the towering mansion hundreds of yards away. The people in that house saw Leo's autism not as a part of who he was, but as an inconvenience to their public image. They saw me merely as the quiet girl who kept the exotic plants alive. I preferred it that way. Invisibility granted me safety. It granted me the freedom to protect Leo without their constant interference. I wiped the soil from my hands and looked toward the back corner of the greenhouse. Behind a dense row of hanging ferns sat a sleek dark metal box. It was a high-capacity digital server. To the outside world and to anyone who happened to wander in it, merely monitored the precise temperature and humidity levels required for rare botanical species. But I built it. I coded it. It tracked the climate, yes, but it also tracked their lies. Through the glass roof, the faint thumping bass of music echoed from the main house. Another elite fundraiser. Another night of shaking hands and securing power. I turned my attention back to the delicate roots of a phalaenopsis orchid. Plants were simple. You give them what they need, and they grow. They do not deceive. They do not trade human dignity for political leverage. The server in the corner hummed quietly. A single blue light blinked in the shadows. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, the calm before a storm that I knew was inevitably coming to our doorstep. The light blinked twice. The main estate was a theater, and every person inside played a highly calculated role. I stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, draped in a plain black dress that was chosen specifically to help me blend into the background. Gregory stood at the center of the room. He wore his tailored suit like a suit of armor, projecting the image of a devoted public servant and an honorable politician. His laughter boomed over the classical music, loud and entirely hollow. Beside him was Lila. She held a crystal glass of sparkling water, smiling warmly at the wives of wealthy donors. She spoke endlessly about her latest charitable foundation, weaving words of compassion that held absolutely no weight. Lila had never cared about the vulnerable. She only cared about how proximity to the vulnerable made her look in the morning papers. Then there was Victoria. My 26-year-old sister moved through the crowd with predatory elegance. She was the golden child, the socialite, the heir apparent to their empire of influence. But as I watched her from the shadows of a towering floral arrangement I had designed myself, I saw the truth of her networking. Victoria was not just socializing. She was guiding young, terribly nervous girls through the crowd. These girls looked entirely out of place among the silver-haired political elite. They clutched their small purses, their smiles fragile and trembling. Victoria would introduce a young woman to a powerful donor, lean in to whisper something in the man's ear, and then smoothly walk away, leaving the girl behind. It was a silent, efficient transaction. To the untrained eye, it looked like a mentorship program, or perhaps a networking opportunity for aspiring interns. But the fear in the eyes of those girls told a completely different story. They were trapped. I watched Victoria glide back toward the terrace doors. She paused, catching my eye through the glass. Her smile vanished instantly. She looked past me, her gaze landing on the greenhouse in the distance. I knew exactly what she was thinking. She hated that I existed, but she hated Leo even more. She saw my young brother as a liability, a stain on the immaculate portrait Gregory and Lila worked so hard to paint for the voters. A donor approached Victoria, holding up a glass and a toast. She instantly turned her charm back on, laughing at a joke that was not funny. I stepped deeper into the shadows, turning my back on the ballroom. They believed they held all the power in this room. They believed their money and their connections made them untouchable. They operated with absolute impunity because no one had ever dared to document their transactions. I took a deep breath of the stifling perfume-heavy air, eager to return to the damp earth of my greenhouse. They were building an empire of glass. It was all a stage. The next morning, the grand estate was suffocatingly quiet. The caterers had cleared the remnants of the gala, erasing all evidence of the previous night. I was back in the greenhouse by 6 o'clock, the cool morning air offering a brief respite. I carefully pruned the dead leaves from a rare ghost orchid. This particular species required meticulous attention. It demanded the perfect balance of light, moisture, and absolute stillness. If you rushed the process, the roots would simply rot from the inside out. The heavy glass door creaked open, breaking the silence. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels against the concrete path signaled the arrival of Lila. She hated the greenhouse. She despised the smell of wet soil and fertilizer, claiming it ruined her clothes. I did not look up from my work as she approached my workstation. "You completely vanished last night, Eilish Lila," said her tone laced with polite disappointment. "Gregory was asking for you. We needed a family portrait for the campaign brochure. It is incredibly selfish of you to hide out here playing in the dirt when your father is securing our future." I carefully set down my pruning shears. I did not raise my voice. I did not apologize. I was told my dress was not the right shade of navy for the camera lighting. I replied evenly, and Leo was overwhelmed by the noise. Someone had to stay with him. Lila sighed, a long theatrical sound of martyrdom. Leo needs to learn how to function in society. Victoria manages to handle her responsibilities flawlessly. She is actively bringing in new endorsements. Meanwhile, I have a 22-year-old daughter who prefers the company of a dog and a mute child. She reached out, running a manicured finger over a clean terracotta pot, checking for dust. "Keep him out of sight when the press arrives this afternoon. Gregory cannot afford any unpredictable outbursts." I looked directly into her eyes. There was no warmth there, only the cold calculation of a woman managing assets. She did not see a daughter. She saw a variable that needed controlling. "Leo will stay in the greenhouse," I said, my voice steady. "He is safe here." "See that he does," Lila replied sharply. She turned on her heel, clearly disgusted by the environment, and marched back toward the door. "And clean yourself up. You look like a laborer." I watched her walk away, feeling the familiar icy detachment settle in my chest. For years their words had stung. For years I had tried to mold myself into the daughter they wanted, but eventually the pain had burned itself out, leaving behind a profound, methodical clarity. I picked up my shears and returned to the orchid. I knew exactly what they were. I knew exactly what Victoria was doing in the shadows of their grand galas. They thought my silence was submission. They did not realize it was observation. The roots ran deep. It was 9:30 in the evening when the fragile facade finally cracked. The estate was hosting a private, unlisted dinner for a select group of Gregory's top-tier financial backers. I had retreated to the greenhouse early, ensuring Leo was settled in his room with Buddy. The greenhouse was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the soft glow of the ultraviolet grow lamps. As I walked down the main aisle, I heard a sharp intake of breath. The sound was small, desperate, like a trapped animal. I stopped, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I moved silently toward the back propagation benches. Hidden beneath a heavy tarp curled into a tight ball on the damp concrete was a girl. She could not have been more than 18. Her elaborate evening gown was torn at the shoulder, and her makeup was completely ruined by tears. I recognized her instantly. She was one of the girls Victoria had paraded through the ballroom the night before. Her name was Maya. "Please," Maya whispered, her voice violently shaking. She recoiled as I stepped closer, throwing her arms over her head. "Please do not call her. Do not tell Victoria. I am here." I knelt slowly, keeping my hands visible and open. "I am not going to call anyone," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level to anchor her panic. "You are safe here. What happened?" Maya let out a muffled sob, pressing her face into her knees. "I cannot go back into that house. She promised me a talent contract. She said she was helping me build a modeling portfolio." Maya's words tumbled out in a rushed, terrified stream. "But she took my passport. She took photos. Private photos. She told me if I did not attend these private meetings with the donors, if I did not do exactly what they asked, she would release everything. She would ruin my life." I stared at her, the cold reality of Victoria's network settling over me like a heavy winter frost. It was not just networking. It was systematic predatory extortion. Victoria was capturing these young women, gathering compromising digital files, and using them as leverage to secure political and financial favors for Gregory. "She uses us," Maya choked out, her entire body trembling. "We are just tools to keep the old men happy. If we speak, she destroys us." I did not offer false comfort. I did not offer useless sympathy. Instead, I reached under the wooden bench, my fingers locating a small hidden switch. It was a secure microphone connected directly to my encrypted server. I flipped it on. Tell me exactly what she made you do, I said calmly. Tell me the names of the men in that room. Maya looked up her eyes, searching mine for any sign of betrayal. Finding none, she began to speak. Every word, every tear, every horrific detail of Victoria's operation was silently documented, encoded, and locked away in the dark. I locked the door. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes from a lifetime of being entirely unseen. As I listened to Maya's trembling voice detail the systematic cruelty of my sister, a profound stillness washed over me. I was not shocked. I was simply validating what I had always known. To understand why I did not immediately run to Gregory or Lila for help, you have to understand the architecture of my childhood. I remembered my 16th birthday. While normal teenagers celebrated with friends, I sat completely alone in the massive dining room. Gregory and Lila were hosting a televised charity event in the grand hall. They had ordered the kitchen staff to leave a slice of cake on the counter for me, instructing me explicitly not to enter the main house and ruin the aesthetic of the evening. They did not forget my birthday. They simply deemed it a public relations liability. I remembered the day I won a prestigious National Botany Award. I was 18, proud of my independent achievement. I brought the heavy glass trophy home and placed it on the kitchen island. Gregory walked in, glanced at it, and frowned. Botany does not pull well in our district, Elish, he had said, his voice flat. It makes you look entirely out of touch with the working class. He picked up the trophy and casually dropped it into the trash bin. Lila had watched him do it and simply told me to clear the garbage. I remembered being forced into stiff matching dresses, positioned precisely 2 steps behind Victoria for endless campaign photographs. Victoria was the brilliant, charismatic future. I was the quiet, necessary prop to prove Gregory was a family man. They never asked about my day. They never asked about my thoughts. They only demanded compliance. In this family, you were either a highly functioning asset or a ghost. Victoria understood the assignment perfectly. She monetized her existence. She realized early on that Gregory valued leverage above all else, so she built an entire underground network to supply him with it. Lila protected the image, Gregory wielded the power, and Victoria gathered the collateral. They normalized their cruelty so gradually that it became the very foundation of our home. I learned to survive by fading into the wallpaper, by demanding nothing and observing everything. I learned how to move without making a sound, how to listen to conversations that were not meant for me, and how to build my own systems of security. Looking at Maya, a girl completely broken by the very people who shared my blood, I felt no familial loyalty. The blood in my veins meant absolutely nothing compared to the evidence on my server. They had spent 22 years ignoring my existence. They were about to discover exactly what happens when you leave a ghost alone in the dark with the keys to the empire. Ghosts see everything clearly. To understand how I survived the suffocating pressure of my family, you must first understand the one person who actually saw me, my grandmother, Ruth. While Gregory and Lila spent their days climbing the political ladder and curating their flawless public image, Ruth spent her time in the dirt. She was the one who originally built the greenhouse on the far edge of the estate. She was a brilliant botanist, a woman who preferred the quiet, complex language of root systems over the hollow chatter of charity galas. Ruth was the only member of this family who looked at Leo and saw a boy with a beautiful, unique mind, rather than a political liability. She was the only one who looked at me and saw potential. When I was 10 years old, while Victoria was attending exclusive etiquette camps, Ruth was teaching me how to graft delicate orchid stems. She taught me that the most beautiful things often require the most meticulous, unseen labor. She also taught me that survival sometimes meant adapting to harsh, unforgiving environments. When Ruth passed away, Gregory immediately drew up plans to bulldoze her greenhouse to make room for a guest pavilion. He despised the structure. He despised what it represented. But Ruth was entirely brilliant. She had placed the greenhouse, and the specific plot of land it sat on, into an ironclad trust. Gregory could not touch it, and he could not legally demolish it. It became my absolute domain. Over the years, as their political ambitions grew darker, and their methods became more manipulative, I retreated further into Ruth's glass sanctuary. I upgraded the facility entirely on my own. I taught myself complex coding to manage the precise environmental controls required for the rare species Ruth had left behind. I built the server from scratch, designing an encrypted network that operated completely independently from the main estate. My parents thought I was merely playing in the mud. They thought my obsession with the climate control server was the harmless, eccentric hobby of a forgettable daughter. They never bothered to look closer. They never realized that the same encrypted drives regulating the humidity for a ghost orchid were also perfectly capable of storing massive amounts of data. Ruth had given me a physical sanctuary. I used the skills she taught me to turn it into a digital fortress. When I synced my local network to the main house's Wi-Fi to download weather patterns, I accidentally found the backdoors into Victoria's hidden files. I saw the extortion. I saw the money. I saw the horrific machine running beneath Gregory's pristine campaign, and I quietly archived every single piece of it. They ignored the gardener. The heavy glass door of the greenhouse burst open, shattering the quiet intimacy of my conversation with Maya. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the overpowering, expensive scent of Victoria's signature perfume. She marched down the central aisle, her designer gown contrasting sharply with the damp concrete. Two large men in dark suits, Gregory's private security detail, stopped at the entrance, crossing their arms. Victoria stopped a few feet away, her eyes locking onto Maya, who was trembling violently behind me. Victoria's perfect smile twisted into a sneer of pure venom. "Get back to the main house immediately, Maya," she ordered, her voice completely devoid of empathy. "Mr. Henderson is waiting for you in the private study. You know what happens if you disappoint him." I stepped firmly between them, shielding the terrified girl. "She is not going anywhere with you," I said calmly. "The game is over, Victoria." Victoria let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. She looked at me as if I were a speck of dirt on her shoe. You are going to stop me, Elish. You are nothing. You are the invisible little weed of this family. If you do not step aside right now, I will personally ensure Leo is sent to a residential facility by morning. He will be heavily medicated and you will never see him or that stupid dog again." The threat against my brother did not induce panic. It induced a profound, icy clarity. I did not move a single inch. "Leave," I repeated, my tone dropping to a quiet command. Victoria's eyes flared with sudden, unhinged fury. She lunged forward, her manicured hands reaching past me to grab Maya's hair. I blocked her path, catching her wrist. For a fraction of a second, she looked genuinely shocked that I had physically defied her. Then her shock morphed into absolute rage. She ripped her arm free and shoved me backward with all of her strength. My heels slipped on the damp edge of the stone steps leading down to the lower propagation tier. Gravity claimed me instantly. I fell backward, the world spinning in a blur of green leaves and harsh light. My shoulder struck the jagged stone edge with a sickening crunch. Pain exploded through my collarbone and radiated down my spine. I hit the lower floor, the impact driving every ounce of air from my lungs. As my vision blurred, I saw Gregory step into the greenhouse. He looked down at my broken body. He did not rush to help me. He did not call for an ambulance. He looked at Victoria, then calmly ordered the guards to take Maya away. They were protecting the Empire. He never looked down. Consciousness returned in slow, agonizing waves. The smell of rich earth and damp orchids was gone, replaced by the sterile chemical scent of medical-grade bleach. I opened my eyes to the harsh, fluorescent lights of a hospital room. It was a VIP recovery suite at the Central General Hospital. The linens were high thread count, and a massive floral arrangement sat on the bedside table. It was a perfectly curated set for a tragedy. Gregory and Lila stood near the window, their voices hushed in deep conversation. Gregory was wearing his tailored navy suit, looking completely unruffled. Lila was dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. As soon as the heart monitor registered my waking pulse, they moved to my bedside. They slipped into their roles flawlessly. "Oh, my sweet girl," Lila cooed, her voice dripping with artificial relief. She gently touched my uninjured arm, making sure not to disrupt any medical equipment. "You gave us such a terrible fright." I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully dry. My right arm was heavily immobilized, strapped tightly across my chest. The pain in my collarbone was blinding, a sharp, constant fire that made it difficult to breathe. "You had a terrible accident," Elish, Gregory said, smoothly leaning over me. His eyes were cold, entirely devoid of paternal concern. "You slipped on that wet moss in your greenhouse and took a nasty fall down the stone stairs. It was terribly careless, but we are just thankful you are alive." I stared at him. The lie was so smooth, so practiced. They had already established the official narrative. There was no mention of Victoria. There was no mention of Maya. It was just careless, invisible Elish making another mistake. I instinctively reached for the bedside table with my good hand, searching for my phone. It was completely empty. "We took your devices home for safekeeping," Lila noted cheerfully, noticing my movement. "You need absolute rest. No distractions." Before I could process the depth of my isolation, the heavy wooden door opened. Dr. Vance, the attending emergency physician, stepped into the room. He was a tall, methodical man with sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He reviewed my digital chart on his tablet, his expression strictly professional. He approached my bed, his gaze flickering briefly to Gregory before settling on me. He gently adjusted the padding around my neck brace. As he leaned in close to check the alignment of my shattered collarbone, his face was obscured from my parents' view. He whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. The angle of this fracture does not match a simple slip. He pulled back instantly, his face, an unreadable mask of medical neutrality. He knew the narrative was entirely false. The lie was unraveling. By the second day, I realized I was not a patient. I was a hostage. The VIP suite was located at the end of a private corridor. Whenever the door opened, I could see two broad-shouldered men in dark suits standing outside. Gregory had installed his private security team under the guise of protecting the family's privacy during a difficult time. No unauthorized nurses were allowed in. No visitors were permitted. I was completely sealed off from the outside world. Lila managed my care with tyrannical precision. She dismissed the hospital staff whenever possible, insisting on feeding me and administering my oral medications herself. It was a masterful display of maternal devotion for anyone watching, but behind closed doors, it was psychological warfare. "You need to focus on healing, Ailish," Lila murmured one afternoon, spooning lukewarm broth into my mouth. Her eyes were hard and completely unsympathetic. "Gregory is handling the press. The narrative is clean. Do not complicate things with whatever delusions you think you remember from that night." I swallowed the broth silently, maintaining a blank expression. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "Leo is asking for you," she continued, casually wiping my chin with a napkin. "He is quite distressed. Victoria is watching him, but she has so little patience for his episodes. It would be a terrible shame if we had to reconsider his living arrangements, because his primary caretaker was deemed mentally unstable due to a traumatic head injury." The threat was veiled in a soft musical tone, but the intent was absolute. She was leveraging my disabled brother to guarantee my silence. Accompanying the emotional blackmail was a deliberate mismanagement of my physical pain. Lila controlled the button for my intravenous pain medication. She administered it just infrequently enough that the agony in my shattered collarbone remained a constant burning presence, yet frequently enough to keep my mind wrapped in a thick, chemical fog. She wanted me docile. She wanted me confused. She wanted me to doubt my own memories of Victoria's violent shove and Maya's terrified face. But Lila underestimated the resilience forged by 2 decades of invisibility. I had spent my entire life enduring their subtle cruelties. A broken bone and a locked door were nothing compared to the quiet strength I had cultivated in the shadows. I focused on the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. I mapped out the dimensions of the room. I cataloged the exact schedule of the nursing shifts. I let the pain anchor me to reality, refusing to drift into the fog. I remained perfectly calm, waiting for the precise moment the system would offer a crack. I swallowed the pain whole. The opportunity arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. The routine of my captivity had become predictable. At precisely 10 o'clock, the hospital's public relations liaison called Lila to discuss the daily press briefing regarding Gregory's campaign. Lila always took these calls in the hallway, unwilling to let even me hear the strategic maneuvering of their public image. As Lila stepped out, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, Dr. Vance entered the room for his morning rounds. This was the 2-minute window I had been calculating. The air in the room instantly shifted from oppressive manipulation to clinical urgency. Dr. Vance moved to my bedside, his eyes scanning my chart before looking down at me. He saw through the heavy sedation. He saw the suppressed agony in my posture. He began changing the dressing on the minor abrasions along my right arm, his movements efficient and gentle. With my uninjured left hand, I slowly reached under the edge of my pillow. Earlier that morning, during a brief moment when a junior nurse had adjusted my bedpan, I had palmed a standard medical pen. Using my teeth and my good hand, I had managed to unwrap a sterile gauze pad, smoothing out the paper backing to use as a makeshift canvas. I waited until Dr. Vance leaned over to inspect my collarbone, shielding my movements from the small observation window in the door. I slipped the folded paper into the deep pocket of his white medical coat. He froze for a fraction of a second. His professional training was impeccable. He did not look down. He did not alter his expression. He simply continued his examination. On that small crumpled piece of paper, I had written a very specific set of instructions. They pushed me. Do not trust them. Need independent psychiatric evaluation to secure competency. Need medical file locked on federal server. They will try to silence me. I looked directly into Dr. Vance's eyes. I did not plead. I did not cry. I offered him the steady, unblinking stare of someone who knew exactly what was happening and exactly how to dismantle it. I was asking a medical professional to step over the line to defy a powerful politician and to protect a patient who was legally an adult but functionally a prisoner. Dr. Vance finished taping the bandage. He picked up his tablet, tapping a few commands into the screen. As he turned to leave, he met my gaze one final time. He gave a microscopic, barely perceptible nod. It was a silent vow of professional defiance. He understood the assignment. The alliance was formed without a single spoken word. The invisible girl finally spoke. The steady, rhythmic dripping of the intravenous fluid became my only measure of time. The physical pain was a heavy, suffocating blanket that wrapped around my chest and radiated outward from my shattered collarbone. Lila had been incredibly meticulous with my medication chart. She ensured the nurses administered just a fraction of the recommended dosage, calculating the precise amount needed to keep me quiet but entirely coherent. She wanted me to feel the consequences of my disobedience. I lay perfectly still, focusing my gaze on the blank ceiling tiles, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a single grimace. The heavy door swung open, allowing the harsh glare of the hallway to spill across the linoleum floor. The overwhelming scent of expensive jasmine perfume preceded her. Victoria walked into the sterile room with the casual elegance of a predator, inspecting a trap. She wore a tailored crimson coat, looking incredibly vibrant against the drab clinical backdrop of my confinement. She stopped at the foot of my bed, her eyes scanning my immobilized arm and the heavy bruising along my neck. "You look absolutely dreadful," Eilish Victoria noted, her voice carrying a light conversational tone that completely masked her malice. She reached out and casually adjusted the blanket near my feet. "I suppose that is what happens when you lose your footing in the dark. You really should be more careful." I kept my breathing steady. I did not look at her perfectly manicured hands. I looked directly into her eyes. "I came to give you an update on our little charity project," Victoria continued, her smile widening just a fraction. "Maya has been safely relocated. She realized that the city was not the right fit for her ambitions. She is far away now, focusing on her portfolio under very strict supervision. You do not need to worry about her anymore." The veiled threat hung heavy in the sterile air. Victoria was confirming that Maya was back under her absolute control, completely trapped within the syndicate. She wanted me to feel utterly powerless. She wanted me to know that my sacrifice had been entirely in vain. And as for Leo, Victoria added, her tone dropping into a much sharper register. She walked around the side of the bed, leaning in close, so her jasmine perfume became physically suffocating. "He has been terribly difficult since you left, crying constantly. Gregory is losing his patience. If you do not recover quickly and quietly, we might have to send that noisy dog of yours to a shelter. Buddy is simply too much of a liability for a busy political household." My heart hammered against my ribs, a spike of pure defensive adrenaline rushing through my veins. The thought of Leo losing his only source of comfort was agonizing. Victoria searched my face eagerly, waiting for the tears, waiting for the desperate pleas she was so accustomed to receiving from her victims. I blinked once. I let the burning pain in my shoulder ground me, pulling my focus away from her emotional manipulation and back to the cold, hard reality of my digital fortress. I did not beg. I did not argue. "Thank you for the update," I said softly. The silence was mine. When Victoria finally left the room, the lingering scent of her perfume slowly dissipated into the sterile ventilation system. I turned my head slightly, my neck muscles protesting against the stiff medical brace, and looked out the narrow window. The sky over the city was a bruised, heavy purple, reflecting the fading light of the afternoon. Staring at the distant gray clouds, my mind drifted back to the damp, quiet sanctuary of my greenhouse. I thought about the rare Phalaenopsis orchids I cultivated in the furthest corners of the glass enclosure. There is a very specific, highly unethical technique used by commercial growers to force those delicate plants to bloom before their natural season. You flood their root systems with harsh chemical stimulants. You artificially manipulate the light cycles, confusing their internal biology. You create an environment of extreme manufactured stress. The plant panics. Believing it is about to die, it throws all of its remaining energy into producing a massive, breathtaking cascade of flowers. The buyers marvel at the vibrant petals, completely oblivious to the fact that the plant is entirely exhausted, its root system permanently damaged by the forced performance. Once the beautiful flowers inevitably drop, the plant is usually discarded, left to wither in the trash because it can never naturally bloom again. As I stared at the gray hospital window, the terrifying parallel settled over me like a heavy stone. This was exactly what Victoria did to those young, terrified women. Maya was not a willing participant in their glamorous political world. She was a flower forced into a desperate artificial bloom. Victoria manipulated their environments, flooded their lives with financial stress and digital blackmail, and forced them to perform for Gregory's wealthy donors. She extracted their youth, their dignity, and their futures to maintain the pristine image of our family empire. And when the girls were finally broken and exhausted, they were simply discarded into the shadows. I had spent my entire life carefully maintaining a beautiful, controlled environment. I had always believed that if I stayed in my corner, if I tended to my soil and kept Leo safe, the poison of my family would not reach us. I thought I could build a safe terrarium inside a burning house. I was completely wrong. The poison was in the foundation. It was in the soil we walked on and the air we breathed. Gregory and Lila were the architects of this magnificent glass cage, and Victoria was the executioner operating within it. I could no longer simply protect my own small corner. I could no longer watch them force innocent people into a corner and harvest their misery for political gain. A cold, methodical resolve replaced the burning pain in my chest. Empathy for Maya transformed into a sharp, calculated weapon. They thought they had pruned away my defiance by locking me in this sterile room. They did not understand the nature of deep roots. To save the delicate things trapped inside this toxic ecosystem, I could not just tend to the leaves. I would shatter the glass. The hospital ward settled into the quiet rhythm of the night shift. The ambient noise faded into the soft, rhythmic hum of the electrocardiogram monitor beside my bed. Lila had visited an hour earlier, ensuring my water pitcher was full and my door was securely guarded by the men in dark suits. She played the role of the exhausted, devoted mother flawlessly for the night nurses before retreating to the family estate. Left entirely alone in the dim light, I closed my eyes and retreated into the architecture of my own mind. I could vividly picture the heavy metal casing of the server sitting in the darkest corner of the greenhouse. I knew the exact hum of its cooling fans. I knew the precise sequence of the encrypted code I had written over 3 years of silent observation. While Victoria collected human collateral and Gregory collected political endorsements, I had collected data. Before Victoria had barged into the greenhouse on that fateful night when Maya was trembling beneath the propagation bench, I had already initiated the final sequence. The moment the hidden microphone had captured Maya's terrified confession, naming the prominent donors and detailing the blackmail network, the audio file had automatically routed to the secured partition of the server. But I had not stopped there. Knowing Victoria's explosive temper and knowing my parents' absolute dedication to damage control, I had activated the protocol I affectionately called the dead man switch. It was an elegant, incredibly ruthless piece of programming. It did not require my active participation to execute. It required my active participation to pause. The system operated on a strict, unyielding countdown. Every 168 hours, exactly 7 days, the server demanded a complex dual-factor authentication that only I possessed. It required my biometric scan on the physical terminal in the greenhouse, combined with a rotating numerical passcode. If that specific authentication was not provided within the allotted timeframe, the server would automatically assume I had been compromised. It would immediately execute a mass data transfer. The encrypted ledgers containing Victoria's offshore transactions, the massive folders of blackmail material she used to control her victims, and the raw audio of Maya's confession would be simultaneously transmitted to 3 federal investigative agencies and 5 major investigative journalism outlets. I mentally reviewed the timeline. The physical confrontation in the greenhouse had occurred late on a Friday evening. It was currently Wednesday night. The silence in my hospital room felt heavy, loaded with invisible tension. Gregory and Lila believed they were actively managing a crisis. They believed that by keeping me isolated and heavily medicated, they were successfully containing the blast radius of Victoria's catastrophic mistake. They had absolutely no idea that their entire empire was sitting on a digital fault line. They were negotiating with a ghost, completely unaware of the massive automated machinery grinding away in the background. I opened my eyes, staring at the blinking green light of the heart monitor. It mirrored the blinking light on the server hundreds of miles away. The machine never sleeps. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the hospital blinds, offering absolutely no warmth. The heavy door swung open, and Gregory walked into the room, followed closely by Victoria. Gregory was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, projecting the absolute authority of a man accustomed to blind obedience. Victoria stood slightly behind him, holding an elegant leather portfolio against her chest. Gregory approached my bed. He offered a tight, completely artificial smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Good morning, Eilish," he said smoothly. "The doctors inform me that your collarbone is stabilizing. It is time we discuss the logistics of your transition back to the estate." He gestured to Victoria, who stepped forward and unclasped the portfolio. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, placing them gently on the adjustable tray table, hovering over my lap. She handed me an expensive fountain pen. "This is a standard non-disclosure agreement combined with a family privacy clause," Gregory explained, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a political speech. "It simply ensures that the unfortunate accident in the greenhouse remains a private family matter. We cannot allow the opposition to twist a simple medical emergency into a scandal during the final weeks of the campaign." I looked down at the documents. The legal jargon was dense, but the intent was brutally clear. I was to forfeit my right to speak about the incident, forfeit my right to pursue any independent legal action, and surrender all digital assets associated with the Greenhouse network to Gregory's corporate holding company. In exchange, the final page outlined the creation of an independent trust fund, specifically designated for Leo's future care. "Sign the documents," Elish Victoria murmured, her voice dripping with condescension. "Do the smart thing. You get your little brother's security and we get our peace of mind. Everyone wins." They were weaponizing the only person I loved to secure their own immunity. They expected me to break. They expected the crushing weight of the institution to force my hand. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. I felt the cold metal against my fingers. I looked at Gregory. I saw the absolute certainty in his posture, the smug assurance of a man who believed he could buy his way out of any consequence. I slowly placed the cap back onto the fountain pen with a soft, definitive click. "I am not signing this," I said, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of emotion. "You cannot buy my silence, Gregory. And you certainly cannot hold my brother hostage to protect a criminal enterprise." Gregory's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of chilling fury. Victoria's eyes widened in genuine shock. She had never witnessed me openly defy the patriarch of our family. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," Gregory warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have absolutely no leverage here. You are entirely dependent on me." I met his furious gaze without blinking. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of fear. I handed the pen back. The refusal hung in the air like a physical barrier. Gregory snatched the fountain pen from my hand, his knuckles turning white. The carefully constructed mask of a benevolent father shattered completely, revealing the ruthless political operator beneath. "You have lost your mind," Gregory hissed, stepping closer to the bed. "Do you truly believe anyone will listen to you? You are a 22-year-old girl recovering from a severe head trauma. If you refuse to cooperate, I will personally ensure that your medical file reflects a complete psychological breakdown. You will not leave this hospital. You will not see Leo. I will erase you completely." He turned sharply, grabbing Victoria by the arm, and stormed toward the door. "No one speaks to her. No one enters this room without my explicit authorization," he barked at the security detail stationed outside. The heavy door slammed shut, the electronic lock engaging with a heavy final thud. The silence rushed back into the room, thicker and more oppressive than before. Gregory believed his authority was absolute. He believed that reality was something he could mold with enough money, enough threats, and enough lawyers. It was a common delusion among the extremely wealthy. They believed that human beings were merely variables that could be manipulated or intimidated into submission. But Gregory did not understand the modern architecture of power. He was a man fighting a 20th century war with intimidation tactics, completely oblivious to the fact that I was wielding a 21st century weapon. I leaned my head back against the stiff hospital pillow. Words could easily be twisted. A crying victim could be painted as hysterical or confused. A medical record could be falsified by a corrupt administrator. But digital truth possessed a terrifying, unyielding permanence. You cannot gaslight an encrypted server. You cannot bribe a blockchain algorithm. You cannot intimidate a string of code that has already been executed. The metadata attached to Victoria's financial ledgers and the pristine audio file of Maya's confession were ironclad. They were impervious to Gregory's political influence. Have you ever been completely silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect you? Tell me below if this resonates. My parents thought they had successfully buried the truth by locking me in this room. They did not realize that by cutting off my access to the outside world, they had guaranteed their own destruction. The dead man switch required my physical presence in the greenhouse to abort the sequence. By guarding my door so fiercely, Gregory was actively preventing me from saving him. I visualized the digital clock running silently on the server back at the estate. The days of silent endurance were rapidly coming to an end. The timer had crossed a critical threshold. There were exactly 48 hours remaining before the automated sequence would bypass every firewall Gregory owned. The trap was perfectly set, and the predators had willingly locked themselves inside. The countdown continued. The refusal hung in the air like a physical barrier. Gregory snatched the fountain pen from my hand, his knuckles turning white. The carefully constructed mask of a benevolent father shattered completely, revealing the ruthless political operator beneath. "You have lost your mind," Gregory hissed, stepping closer to the bed. "Do you truly believe anyone will listen to you? You are a 22-year-old girl recovering from a severe head trauma. If you refuse to cooperate, I will personally ensure that your medical file reflects a complete psychological breakdown. You will not leave this hospital. You will not see Leo. I will erase you completely." He turned sharply, grabbing Victoria by the arm, and stormed toward the door. "No one speaks to her. No one enters this room without my explicit authorization," he barked at the security detail stationed outside. The heavy door slammed shut, the electronic lock engaging with a heavy final thud. The silence rushed back into the room, thicker and more oppressive than before. Gregory believed his authority was absolute. He believed that reality was something he could mold with enough money, enough threats, and enough lawyers. It was a common delusion among the extremely wealthy. They believed that human beings were merely variables that could be manipulated or intimidated into submission. But Gregory did not understand the modern architecture of power. He was a man fighting a 20th century war with intimidation tactics, completely oblivious to the fact that I was wielding a 21st century weapon. I leaned my head back against the stiff hospital pillow, ignoring the throbbing pain in my shoulder. Words could easily be twisted by expensive lawyers. A crying victim could be painted as hysterical or deeply confused. A medical record could be temporarily falsified by a corrupt hospital administrator looking for a political favor. But digital truth possessed a terrifying, unyielding permanence. You cannot gaslight an encrypted server. You cannot bribe a decentralized blockchain algorithm. You cannot intimidate a sophisticated string of code that has already been executed. The metadata attached to Victoria's financial ledgers and the pristine, unedited audio file of Maya's confession were absolutely ironclad. They were completely impervious to Gregory's political influence. Have you ever been completely silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect you? Tell me below if this resonates. My parents thought they had successfully buried the truth by locking me in this sterile room. They did not realize that by aggressively cutting off my access to the outside world, they had practically guaranteed their own destruction. The dead man switch required my physical presence in the greenhouse to abort the data transfer sequence. By guarding my door so fiercely, Gregory was actively preventing me from saving his empire. I visualized the digital clock running silently on the server back at the dark estate. The long, agonizing days of silent endurance were rapidly coming to a definitive end. The timer had crossed a critical, irreversible threshold. There were exactly 48 hours remaining before the automated sequence would bypass every firewall Gregory owned. The trap was perfectly set. The countdown continued. The heavy hospital door opened, interrupting the tense silence of my room. Dr. Vance walked in, but this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by a much older man with silver hair and a stern expression. His badge identified him as the chief of orthopedic surgery. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantaneously. Lila, who had been sitting scrolling through her phone, immediately stood up, smoothing her designer skirt and arranging her features into the portrait of a deeply concerned mother. Doctors Lila greeted them, her voice a perfect pitch of maternal anxiety. Has there been a complication with Ailish's recovery? We are prepared to transfer her to a private facility if she requires more specialized attention. The chief of surgery did not return her warm smile. He carried a digital tablet, holding it squarely in front of him like a shield. He glanced at my immobilized shoulder, then looked directly at Lila and Gregory, who had just stepped out from the private restroom. There are no complications with the healing process, the chief stated, his voice carrying the heavy weight of absolute professional authority. However, there is a significant complication with the incident report filed upon admission. Dr. Vance requested a secondary review of the initial emergency x-rays, which I personally conducted this morning. Gregory stepped forward, his political instincts kicking in. He attempted to dominate the space with his physical presence. I assure you, gentlemen, we were entirely thorough in our report. It was a tragic, clumsy fall in an incredibly damp greenhouse. The chief of surgery tapped the screen of his tablet, turning it around so Gregory and Lila could clearly see the high-resolution images of my shattered bones. I remained perfectly still, watching the confrontation unfold from the silence of my pillows. Physics and human anatomy tell a very different story, Mr. Henderson, the chief explained coldly. The specific angle of the clavicle fracture combined with the severe contusions along the upper thoracic spine are completely inconsistent with a downward, unassisted slip. These injuries require a significant horizontal application of blunt force. He paused, letting the clinical terminology hang in the sterile air. In simple terms, Dr. Vance added, stepping out from behind his superior, she was pushed with extreme, deliberate force. This is not a simple liability issue. Lila's perfectly painted lips parted in genuine shock. She looked at Gregory, waiting for him to deploy his usual tactics of intimidation. But the doctors were not finished. Because these injuries strongly indicate an assault, and because the initial narrative was demonstrably falsified, the chief continued, tucking the tablet under his arm. Hospital protocol and federal medical ethics require us to flag this file. We are legally obligated to formally notify the authorities to conduct an independent investigation into the circumstances of her injuries. Gregory's face went rigid. His carefully constructed reality was colliding with irrefutable scientific truth. He opened his mouth to argue, to invoke his status, but the doctors were already turning toward the door. They had not come to negotiate, They had come to deliver a verdict based entirely on documented evidence. The truth was now documented. As soon as the heavy door clicked shut behind the two doctors, the meticulously crafted facade of my family completely disintegrated. The silence in the VIP suite was replaced by an electric, suffocating panic. Lila sank into the leather guest chair, the color draining entirely from her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her expensive handbag. "Gregory," she whispered, her voice stripped of all its usual theatrical resonance. "If the hospital files an assault report, the press will be digging into our estate records by tomorrow morning. They will question Victoria. The campaign will be absolutely destroyed." Gregory did not answer her immediately. He was already pacing the length of the room, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. He was dialing numbers with furious, aggressive jabs of his thumb. He was calling the hospital's board of directors men whose charity foundations had benefited directly from his political maneuvering over the years. I watched him from my bed, feeling no fear, only a profound sense of clinical observation. I listened as Gregory lowered his voice into a sharp, threatening murmur. "I do not care about protocol," Gregory hissed into the phone, turning his back to me. "I am telling you that your emergency staff has made a gross miscalculation. My daughter has a documented history of severe clumsiness. I need that file sealed. I need the narrative amended immediately before some overzealous resident alerts the local authorities." There was a long pause as the person on the other end spoke. I could not hear the words, but I could read the exact moment Gregory's absolute power failed him. His shoulders stiffened. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. "What do you mean it is already synced?" Gregory demanded, his voice rising in authentic desperation. "Unsync it. Pull it from the federal database." Another pause. The reality of modern medical infrastructure was crashing down upon him. Dr. Vance had been incredibly smart. By requesting an independent psychiatric hold and syncing my trauma records to the central offsite system, he had effectively removed the data from the local server. Gregory could easily bribe a local hospital administrator, but he could not bribe a decentralized federal database. The digital footprint was permanent. Gregory ended the call, staring blankly at the wall. For the very first time in my 22 years of life, I saw my father look genuinely terrified. His money was useless. His connections were suddenly impotent against a sequence of ones and zeros protecting a medical truth. Victoria burst into the room a moment later, bypassing the security guards. She looked frantic, her usual composure completely shattered. "The lawyers are downstairs," she announced breathlessly, looking between our parents. "They said the hospital legal team just notified them about an impending inquiry. Gregory, you have to fix this. I cannot just erase it." "Victoria," Gregory snapped, losing his temper completely. "The files are out of our local jurisdiction." I closed my eyes, letting the soft hum of the medical machines soothe the throbbing in my shoulder. They were tearing themselves apart, completely unaware of the much larger threat quietly ticking away in the background. The walls were closing in. The atmosphere inside the hospital room rapidly shifted from a medical recovery space into a hostile legal war zone. Within 20 minutes of Victoria's arrival, the door opened to admit 3 men in sharply tailored, immaculate suits. These were not the friendly family attorneys who handled real estate transfers. These were Gregory's crisis management specialists, men who specialized in making massive political liabilities quietly disappear into the shadows. The lead attorney, a tall man with a predatory gaze, immediately began whispering furiously with Gregory in the far corner of the room. Lila sat rigidly in her chair, nervously twisting her diamond rings, while Victoria paced the length of the window, constantly checking her phone. The energy they projected was suffocating, a heavy cloud of intimidation meant to force my absolute compliance. I remained perfectly still against my pillows. I did not shrink away. I did not look at the ceiling to avoid their stares. I kept my breathing slow and measured, focusing entirely on the internal clock running relentlessly in my mind. I mentally verified the timeline. It was early Thursday afternoon. The dead man switch required my biometric authentication exactly 7 days from the moment of activation. Based on my calculations, the encrypted server back in the greenhouse had exactly 60 minutes remaining before the master protocol executed, in 1 hour. The entire digital vault containing Victoria's extortion files and Gregory's dark money trails would automatically flood the inboxes of federal investigators. I was sitting in the very center of a massive hurricane, experiencing the deceptive, quiet calm before the absolute devastation hit. I thought about Leo, imagining him sitting safely in his room with Buddy. I thought about Maya praying. She had found a safe place to hide until the authorities dismantled Victoria's network. Everything I had endured over the past few days, the physical agony, the psychological manipulation, the forced isolation had been carefully calculated to buy the server enough time. If you've ever had to face down your abusers while completely alone, hit that like button. The whispering in the corner finally ceased. Gregory nodded sharply at the lead attorney. his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated resolve. They had formulated their strategy. They believed that because I was physically broken and isolated, I would eventually fold under the crushing weight of their combined authority. They were preparing to deliver the final crushing blow to secure my silence. I watched the men turn and approach my bed, forming a physical barricade between me and the door. They looked like a firing squad preparing to execute a prisoner. I felt my pulse slow down, entering a state of absolute chilling tranquility. I did not need to run. I did not need to fight them physically. I just needed to let the clock run out. I was ready for them. The atmosphere inside the hospital room rapidly shifted from a sterile medical recovery space into a highly aggressive legal war zone. Within 20 minutes of Victoria's frantic arrival, the door opened to admit 3 men in sharply tailored, immaculate suits. These were not the friendly family attorneys who handled routine real estate transfers or minor civil disputes. These were Gregory's elite crisis management specialists. Ruthless operators who specialized in making massive political liabilities quietly disappear into the shadows. The lead attorney, a tall man with a predatory, unblinking gaze, immediately began whispering furiously with Gregory in the far corner of the room. Lila sat rigidly in her leather chair, nervously twisting her heavy diamond rings, while Victoria paced the length of the window, constantly checking her muted phone. The collective energy they projected was suffocating, a heavy cloud of calculated intimidation meant to force my absolute, unquestioning compliance. I remained perfectly still against my stiff pillows. I did not shrink away from their presence. I did not look at the ceiling, to avoid their hostile stares. I kept my breathing deliberately slow and measured, focusing entirely on the internal clock running relentlessly in my mind. I mentally verified the precise timeline. It was early Thursday afternoon. The dead man switch required my dual-factor biometric authentication exactly 7 days from the moment of its initial activation. Based on my careful calculations, the encrypted server sitting in the dark corner of my greenhouse had exactly 60 minutes remaining before the master protocol executed. In 1 hour, the entire digital vault containing Victoria's horrific extortion files and Gregory's illicit dark money trails would automatically flood the secure inboxes of federal investigators and major journalists. I was sitting in the very center of a massive hurricane, experiencing the deceptive, eerie calm before the absolute devastation hit the shore. I thought about little Leo, imagining him sitting safely in his room, brushing his fingers through Buddy's golden fur. I thought about Maya praying she had found a secure place to hide until the authorities finally dismantled Victoria's network. Everything I had silently endured over the past few days, the blinding physical agony, the relentless psychological manipulation, the forced isolation, had been carefully calculated to buy the automated server enough time. If you've ever had to face down your abusers while completely alone, hit that like button. The frantic whispering in the corner finally ceased. Gregory nodded sharply at the lead attorney, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated resolve. They had formulated their final strategy. They truly believed that because I was physically broken and entirely isolated, I would eventually fold under the crushing weight of their combined legal authority. They were preparing to deliver the final crushing blow to secure my silence. I watched the men turn in unison and approach my bed, forming a solid physical barricade between me and the only exit. They looked like a sophisticated firing squad preparing to execute a silent prisoner. I felt my pulse slow down, entering a state of absolute chilling tranquility. I did not need to run or fight. I was ready for them. The lead attorney stepped up to the side of my bed. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer any false pleasantries regarding my health. He simply unbuttoned his suit jacket, projecting an air of absolute, undeniable dominance. Gregory stood slightly behind him, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, while Victoria hovered near the foot of the bed, a cruel, expectant smirk playing on her lips. Miss Henderson, the attorney, began his voice, a low, gravelly baritone designed to intimidate. Your father has been incredibly patient with your current emotional instability. However, that patience has officially expired. The hospital's intention to file an inquiry is a minor bureaucratic hurdle that we will easily suppress. But we require your immediate cooperation to ensure there are no lingering complications. He pulled a fresh, impeccably printed document from his leather briefcase and dropped it onto my tray table. It was much thicker than the previous non-disclosure agreement. If you continue to refuse your signature, and if you insist on promoting this absurd narrative that you were assaulted, we will not simply cut you off financially, the lawyer stated smoothly. We will initiate immediate legal proceedings to place you under a permanent medical conservatorship. We have 3 independent specialists ready to testify that your traumatic brain injury has rendered you completely incompetent. Lila let out a soft, theatrical sob from her chair. Please, Elish, she wept, her voice trembling perfectly. Do not make your father do this. We just want our family to be whole again. Think of the terrible shame you are bringing upon us. Once the conservatorship is granted, the attorney continued, completely ignoring Lila's performance. Your father will possess full legal authority over your medical care, your finances, and your physical location. You will be transferred to a secure psychiatric facility of our choosing. Your access to the outside world will be entirely restricted. And your younger brother will be placed in a specialized boarding school out of state. The threat was absolute. They were stripping away my humanity, attempting to reduce me to a legal object they could lock away in a dark box forever. They expected me to panic. They expected the sheer terror of losing my autonomy and losing Leo to force me into immediate weeping submission. I looked at the document. Then I looked up, making direct, unflinching eye contact with Gregory. The pain in my shoulder faded into the background. My voice when I finally spoke was not a desperate plea. It was a calm, meticulously measured strike. You cannot suppress a federal inquiry, Gregory, I said quietly, the stillness in my tone causing the lawyer to visibly pause. And you certainly cannot place me under a conservatorship when you are actively facing a federal indictment for extortion and campaign finance fraud. Gregory's posture stiffened. What absolute nonsense are you talking about? He demanded, though a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. Let them play their hand. The silence in the room became incredibly dense, suffocating everyone except me. I adjusted my uninjured arm, resting my hand calmly over the blanket. I did not look at the lawyer. I addressed the architect of this nightmare directly. I am talking about the offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, I said, my voice carrying the steady, detached rhythm of a financial auditor reading a quarterly report, the one Victoria uses to funnel the payments from your political donors. Account number ending in 4729. Victoria gasped audibly, stepping backward as if she had been physically struck. The smirk was completely wiped from her face. I shifted my gaze to her. I am also talking about Marcus Vance, CEO of Vance Pharmaceuticals, and Senator Thomas Reed, and the real estate developer William Hayes. I listed the names with absolute devastating precision. 3 of your most generous VIP donors. 3 men who actively participated in the private meetings you arranged for Maya, and 6 other underage girls over the last 14 months. The lead attorney stopped writing on his legal pad. His pen hovered motionless in the air. He slowly turned his head to look at Gregory, the realization dawning that his client had deliberately withheld catastrophic criminal liabilities from his legal counsel. Shut up, Victoria hissed, her voice trembling with sudden, explosive panic. Gregory, make her shut up right now. She is completely delusional. I did not stop. I maintained the exact same calm, dignified tone. I know about the digital folders, Victoria. I know exactly how you categorize the blackmail footage by donor name to ensure Gregory's campaign receives maximum funding without direct interference. You forced those girls into hotel rooms, recorded them without consent, and used their terror to secure political endorsements. That is enough, Gregory roared, losing every ounce of his political composure. The veins in his neck bulged, and his face turned a dark, furious shade of crimson. He lunged forward, grabbing the metal railing of my hospital bed. You know absolutely nothing. You are an invisible little gardener playing dangerous games. I will destroy you for even suggesting these lies. They are not lies, Gregory, I replied softly. They are meticulously documented facts. Facts that have been actively backing up to my encrypted server in the greenhouse for the past 3 years. You thought my server was just a glorified thermostat for my orchids. You never bothered to check the network traffic pulling directly from Victoria's unsecured laptop. Lila let out a genuine, horrifying wail, dropping her face into her hands. The performance was entirely over. She realized the empire she had sacrificed her soul to protect was currently burning to the ground, and the quiet daughter she had always ignored was the one holding the match. The lawyers were already packing their briefcases, their professional instincts warning them to distance themselves immediately from a sinking criminal ship. Gregory stared at me, his chest heaving, his mind desperately searching for a way out of the digital corner I had painted him into. The empire was crumbling down. Victoria's face contorted into something incredibly ugly and completely unrecognizable. The polished, elegant socialite vanished in an instant, entirely replaced by a desperate, cornered animal whose trap had just snapped shut. She let out a raw, guttural scream, a sound completely devoid of human dignity, and lunged across the narrow space between the window and my hospital bed. Her hands, adorned with expensive jewelry, reached violently toward me. The lead attorney, possessing the rapid reflexes of a man deeply accustomed to managing volatile, unpredictable clients, intercepted her instantly. He grabbed her firmly by the waist and pulled her backward, pinning her shoulders against the sterile beige wall. "Do not touch her," the attorney barked, his professional composure briefly slipping. He knew that physically assaulting a vulnerable patient in a crowded hospital ward, would immediately trigger an irreversible arrest, completely destroying any lingering chance of legal mitigation. Victoria thrashed against his grip, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a terrifying mixture of hatred and absolute panic. Lila, witnessing the sudden violent collapse of her perfect daughter, fell to her knees right there on the cold linoleum floor. The performance of the concerned stoic mother was completely abandoned. She crawled to the side of my bed, her manicured hands desperately grasping the cold metal safety rail. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. "Eilish, please, I am begging you," Lila sobbed, her voice trembling with genuine, uncalculated terror. "You are destroying us. You are completely destroying everything we have painstakingly built for you and for Leo. If this goes public, we will lose the house. We will lose the foundation. Do you truly want your little brother to grow up in a broken, publicly disgraced family? We can fix this quietly. We can go to therapy." I looked down at her. I felt absolutely no pity, and I felt absolutely no anger. I only felt the quiet, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I looked at the woman who had deliberately withheld my pain medication, the woman who had watched her husband throw my achievements into the garbage, the woman who had turned a blind eye while her eldest daughter destroyed the lives of innocent 18-year-old girls. "You are not a family, Lila," I stated calmly, making sure my voice carried clearly across the room. "You are a criminal syndicate operating behind a charitable foundation, and Leo was never a part of your perfect picture. He was just a convenient prop you used for sympathy." The three attorneys exchanged a series of incredibly rapid silent glances. They were calculating the immense radioactive fallout of the specific names I had just recited. They were realizing that the retainer Gregory had paid them would never cover the catastrophic legal exposure of defending a systematic political extortion ring involving minors. The atmosphere in the room shifted from aggressive intimidation to chaotic, disorganized survival instinct. Gregory stood completely frozen at the foot of the bed. His jaw was slack. The absolute power he had wielded for decades had been utterly neutralized by a few spoken sentences. He was staring at me as if he were looking at a complete stranger, finally realizing the immense danger of ignoring the invisible girl in the greenhouse. The illusion was entirely gone. I slowly adjusted my posture against the stiff pillows, carefully ignoring the sharp, radiating spike of pain in my fractured collarbone. The air in the room was breathing heavily around me, thick with the scent of Victoria's panic and Lila's desperate, echoing sobs. Gregory finally found his voice, though it lacked the booming, resonant authority that usually commanded political auditoriums. "I will have my private security team dismantle that greenhouse within the hour," Gregory threatened, his voice shaking with a terrifying, uncharacteristic tremor. "Have them smash your ridiculous servers into 1,000 pieces and burn the hard drives into ash. You have absolutely nothing." I offered him a small, incredibly patient smile. It was the smile of someone who had anticipated this exact reaction months in advance. "The server in the greenhouse is completely automated, Gregory," I explained, keeping my voice soft, precise, and perfectly modulated. "It utilizes a military-grade encryption sequence that I carefully coded myself over the past 3 years. It operates entirely isolated from your vulnerable estate network. You cannot simply unplug it from the wall. You cannot hire an expensive technician to hack it." The lead attorney took a slow step forward, his predatory instincts entirely focused on the technical mechanics of my claim. He recognized the distinct vocabulary of a genuine threat. "If the physical hard drive is compromised in any way, if it is tampered with by your guards, or if it loses its dedicated power supply for more than 60 seconds, the ultimate failsafe protocol executes immediately," I continued calmly. "The system strictly requires my dual-factor biometric scan and a rotating numerical passcode to delay the automated data transfer." I paused, letting the absolute severity of the situation sink into their panicked minds. I looked at the digital clock mounted on the hospital wall. "If I do not physically provide that specific authentication within the next 45 minutes, the entire unredacted archive will be automatically transmitted," I said softly. "The financial ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the raw audio files of Maya's confession will be sent directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, and 5 independent investigative journalism outlets simultaneously." Victoria stopped struggling against the lawyer's grip. She stared at me, her eyes wide, with the horrifying realization that her entire glamorous existence was tethered to a digital countdown she could not control. Gregory reached out, grasping the edge of the heavy wooden chair to steady his trembling legs. He realized with absolute crushing clarity that his immense wealth could not buy the silence of an autonomous algorithm. The lawyers began silently packing their leather briefcases. They were slipping their confidential folders and gold-plated pens away, their body language, screaming their intention to formally abandon this sinking ship. They were paid to manage public relations crises, not to defend federally indictable offenses involving blackmail networks. They were actively walking away from the Empire. The clock was running out. For one long, agonizing minute, the hospital room was perfectly silent, save for the rhythmic, steady beeping of my heart monitor. The lawyers had their hands on the brass handles of the heavy door, ready to execute their tactical retreat. Then Gregory slowly straightened his posture. The genuine terror in his eyes miraculously receded, replaced by a cold, calculating cruelty that had built his political career. He looked at the lead attorney. "Do not leave this room yet," Gregory commanded, his voice regaining a fraction of its former icy authority. The attorney hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. Gregory reached deliberately into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single folded piece of thick legal paper. He walked confidently to my bedside and dropped the document onto my tray table. He smiled a chilling, triumphant expression. "You are a highly intelligent girl," Elish Gregory said smoothly, "but you fundamentally underestimated the sheer scope of my resources. This is an emergency medical directive signed by a superior court judge exactly 2 hours ago. It grants me immediate, absolute medical and legal conservatorship over you based on an emergency psychiatric affidavit citing severe post-traumatic delusions." Lila gasped, looking up from the floor with a sudden glimmer of desperate hope. As your legally appointed guardian, Gregory continued, his tone dripping with absolute arrogance, "I possess the exclusive authority to forcibly relocate you to a secure lockdown psychiatric facility right now. More importantly, I hold the legal right to dispatch an authorized municipal technician to dismantle your server under the guise of removing dangerous property belonging to an incompetent dependent. The authorities will completely ignore an automated email dump coming from a legally documented psychiatric patient. They genuinely believed they had executed a flawless checkmate. They believed the law would serve as the ultimate silencer. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice in protest. I simply reached out with my uninjured hand and pressed the red call button pinned to my hospital gown. Less than 10 seconds later, Dr. Vance entered the room holding a sealed blue folder bearing the insignia of the Federal Medical Board. "You are fundamentally mistaken about jurisdiction, Gregory," I said evenly, offering a polite nod to the doctor. "A temporary, locally sourced directive can be instantly nullified by an independent federal-level competency evaluation." Dr. Vance bypassed Gregory entirely and handed the sealed blue folder directly to the lead attorney. "This comprehensive evaluation was conducted 48 hours ago, countersigned by a panel of 3 federal psychiatrists," Dr. Vance stated clinically. "She is completely competent, highly lucid, and entirely in control of her own medical and legal autonomy." The lead attorney quickly scanned the document. He dropped the paper onto the tray table, alongside Gregory's useless court order. He looked at Gregory, shook his head with finality, and walked out the door without looking back. Gregory stared at the blue folder, his political armor fracturing completely. He realized his money and his local judges were completely powerless against federal medical protocol. The trap had completely closed. The digital clock in the architecture of my mind finally hit 0. At that exact moment, somewhere in the quiet, damp corner of the remote greenhouse, the heavily encrypted server executed its final automated line of code. The massive digital files effortlessly bypassed Gregory's expensive state-of-the-art estate firewall and simultaneously flooded the secure monitored servers of federal agencies across the country. The oppressive silence in the hospital room was suddenly violently shattered by the simultaneous buzzing of 3 different cell phones. Gregory's phone rang. Victoria's phone rang. Lila's phone chimed with a relentless stream of urgent text messages. Gregory pulled his device from his pocket with a visibly trembling hand. He stared blindly at the glowing screen, reading the frantic capitalized messages pouring in from his senior campaign manager. The news had already broken locally. Independent journalists, having received the automated data dump, were actively verifying the authenticity of the audio files and cross-referencing the offshore bank routing numbers. "No," Gregory whispered the single syllable, completely hollow and utterly defeated. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out as he collapsed heavily into the leather chair Lila had previously occupied. He stared at his hands, watching his decades of carefully curated power evaporate into the digital ether. Victoria was hyperventilating. She dropped her expensive handbag onto the floor, pulling at her hair in a display of genuine, uncontrollable panic. She realized that the young women she had so ruthlessly manipulated were no longer silenced. Maya's trembling voice was currently echoing through the headphones of federal prosecutors. Then the heavy, unmistakable sound of coordinated footsteps echoed down the hospital corridor. It was not the soft tread of private security guards, but the heavy boots of local law enforcement, accompanied by several serious-looking individuals wearing federal windbreakers. They entered the VIP suite with complete authority, entirely ignoring Gregory's weak attempts to stand and invoke his political status. Victoria Henderson, the lead investigator, stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he stepped toward my sister. You are under arrest for multiple counts of extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and reckless endangerment. Victoria collapsed to her knees, screaming and sobbing hysterically as they calmly secured the heavy metal handcuffs around her wrists. She begged Gregory to do something to call his friends on the board, but Gregory simply sat in the chair, staring vacantly at the wall. The police officers escorted her out of the room, her cries fading down the hallway. 2 other agents approached Gregory, holding printed warrants to seize his remaining electronic devices and formally notifying him of his impending indictment for campaign finance violations. Lila wept silently in the corner, realizing her charity galas were permanently canceled. I watched them dismantle the empire from the safety of my hospital bed. I felt absolutely no guilt. I only felt the profound cleansing relief of a massive toxic weight being lifted from my chest. The glass empire was shattered. The digital clock in the architecture of my mind finally hit 0. At that exact moment, somewhere in the quiet, damp corner of the remote greenhouse, the heavily encrypted server executed its final automated line of code. The massive digital files effortlessly bypassed Gregory's expensive state-of-the-art estate firewall and simultaneously flooded the secure, monitored servers of federal agencies across the entire country. The oppressive silence in the hospital room was suddenly violently shattered by the simultaneous buzzing of 3 different cell phones. Gregory's phone rang. Victoria's phone rang. Lila's phone chimed with a relentless, terrifying stream of urgent text messages. Gregory pulled his device from his pocket with a visibly trembling hand. He stared blindly at the glowing screen, reading the frantic capitalized messages pouring in from his senior campaign manager. The catastrophic news had already broken locally. Independent journalists, having received the automated data dump, were actively verifying the authenticity of the audio files and meticulously cross-referencing the offshore bank routing numbers. No, Gregory whispered the single syllable, completely hollow and utterly defeated. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out, as he collapsed heavily into the leather guest chair. He stared blankly at his empty hands, watching his decades of carefully curated political power evaporate into the digital ether. Victoria was actively hyperventilating. She dropped her expensive leather handbag onto the sterile floor, pulling at her styled hair in a display of genuine, uncontrollable panic. She suddenly realized that the young women she had so ruthlessly manipulated were no longer silenced. Maya's trembling voice was currently echoing through the secure headphones of federal prosecutors. Then the heavy, unmistakable sound of coordinated footsteps echoed down the long hospital corridor. It was not the soft tread of private security guards, but the heavy, authoritative boots of local law enforcement, accompanied by several serious-looking individuals wearing federal windbreakers. They entered the VIP suite with complete authority, entirely ignoring Gregory's weak, pathetic attempts to stand and invoke his political status. Victoria Henderson, the lead federal investigator, stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he stepped toward my sister. You are officially under arrest for multiple federal counts of extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and reckless endangerment. Victoria collapsed heavily to her knees, screaming and sobbing hysterically as they calmly secured the heavy metal handcuffs around her wrists. She begged Gregory to do something to call his wealthy friends on the hospital board, but Gregory simply sat in the chair, completely paralyzed. The police officers efficiently escorted her out of the room, her desperate cries fading down the long hallway. 2 other agents approached Gregory, holding printed warrants to seize his remaining electronic devices and formally notifying him of his impending indictment for campaign finance violations. Lila wept silently in the corner, realizing her glamorous charity galas were permanently canceled. I watched them completely dismantle the empire from the safety of my hospital bed. I felt absolutely no guilt. I only felt the profound cleansing relief of a massive, toxic weight being lifted. The glass empire was shattered. 6 tranquil months had passed since the morning the federal agents walked into my sterile hospital room. The political scandal had completely consumed the city, dominating the headlines for weeks. Gregory had been forced to resign his political position in absolute public disgrace, and he was currently awaiting trial on multiple federal counts of campaign finance, fraud, and conspiracy. Victoria was securely behind bars. Denied bail due to the severe flight risk and the overwhelming, undeniable weight of the digital evidence I had provided. Lila had completely retreated from society, checking herself into a highly secluded private rehabilitation clinic, desperately trying to salvage whatever remained of her shattered public image. I never looked back. I never visited them. I let the justice system dismantle the remaining pieces of their toxic legacy. I had successfully petitioned the family court for full legal guardianship of Leo, utilizing the massive independent trust fund Gregory had so arrogantly established in his failed attempt to buy my silence. I secured the absolute financial foundation for our independence. We had moved far away from the oppressive, fog-heavy estate, leaving the dark memories behind us. I purchased a large, sunlit property on the vibrant edge of the valley. It featured 3 sprawling, industrial-sized greenhouses with expansive glass roofs that let in an abundance of natural light. I spent months meticulously transforming the property into a legitimate sanctuary. It was no longer just a quiet place for cultivating rare, delicate orchids. It was a fully funded, specialized rehabilitation center, utilizing horticultural therapy. It was a safe haven explicitly designed for young women who had survived predatory extortion networks. It provided them with free legal counsel, psychological support, and a peaceful environment to literally and figuratively put their hands back into the soil. I walked down the bright, warm aisle of the main greenhouse carrying a watering can. The air smelled of fresh jasmine and wet earth. At the far end of the facility, sitting peacefully on a wooden bench, was Leo. He was gently running his fingers over the thick green leaves of a monstera plant, completely relaxed and entirely unburdened by the terrifying expectations of our former lives. Beside him, Buddy the golden retriever slept lazily in a patch of warm sunlight, his tail thumping softly against the concrete floor. I set the watering can down and took a deep, unobstructed breath. The chronic pain in my collarbone had faded into a dull, manageable ache, a permanent physical reminder of the price I had paid for our freedom. But the psychological chains had been completely severed. We were no longer props in a political theater. We were no longer invisible. We were finally entirely safe. 6 tranquil healing months had passed since the chaotic morning the federal agents walked into my sterile hospital room. The explosive political scandal had completely consumed the city, dominating the relentless news headlines for several consecutive weeks. Gregory had been forced to abruptly resign his political position, in absolute, undeniable public disgrace, and he was currently confined to a small apartment, awaiting trial on multiple federal counts of campaign finance, fraud, and systemic conspiracy. Victoria was securely locked behind bars, definitively denied bail due to the severe flight risk and the overwhelming, undeniable weight of the digital evidence I had meticulously provided. Lila had completely retreated from high society, checking herself into a highly secluded, incredibly expensive private rehabilitation clinic. She was desperately trying to salvage whatever remained of her shattered public image, entirely abandoned by the wealthy friends she had spent decades cultivating. I never looked back. I never visited them. I let the federal justice system methodically dismantle the remaining rotting pieces of their toxic legacy. I had successfully petitioned the local family court for full, permanent legal guardianship of Leo. Utilizing the massive independent trust fund Gregory had so arrogantly established in his desperate failed attempt to buy my permanent silence, I secured the absolute financial foundation for our new independence. We had moved hundreds of miles away from the oppressive, fog-heavy estate, leaving the dark, suffocating memories entirely behind us. I purchased a large, incredibly sunlit property on the vibrant, lush edge of the valley. It featured 3 sprawling, industrial-sized greenhouses with expansive, reinforced glass roofs that let in a brilliant abundance of natural light. I spent 4 months meticulously transforming the sprawling property into a legitimate, functioning sanctuary. It was no longer just a quiet, isolated place for cultivating rare, delicate orchids. It was a fully funded, highly specialized rehabilitation center, utilizing professional horticultural therapy. It was a beautiful, safe haven explicitly designed for young women who had miraculously survived predatory extortion networks. The sanctuary provided them with completely free legal counsel, extensive psychological support, and a remarkably peaceful environment to literally and figuratively put their healing hands back into the rich soil. I walked slowly down the bright, warm aisle of the main greenhouse, carrying a heavy copper watering can. The clean air smelled beautifully of fresh jasmine and wet, fertile earth. At the far end of the pristine facility, sitting peacefully on a comfortable wooden bench, was Leo. He was gently running his small fingers over the thick, vibrant green leaves of a massive monstera plant, completely relaxed and entirely unburdened by the terrifying, suffocating expectations of our former lives. Beside him, Buddy the golden retriever slept lazily in a wide patch of warm sunlight, his tail thumping softly and rhythmically against the warm concrete floor. I set the heavy watering can down and took a deep, incredibly unobstructed breath. The chronic pain in my healing collarbone had finally faded into a dull, highly manageable ache. It served as a permanent physical reminder of the exact price I had paid for our absolute freedom. But the heavy psychological chains had been completely severed. We were no longer invisible props. We were finally entirely safe. The afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the concrete floor of the main greenhouse when my personal cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I set down my pruning shears and pulled the device out. The caller ID displayed a restricted number, but I recognized the specific area code. It belonged to an ultra-exclusive, highly secluded wellness retreat located high in the coastal mountains. It was the exact facility where Lila had quietly checked herself in to escape the relentless media scrutiny. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call entirely, but I knew the psychology of a woman who had spent decades meticulously managing a public image. She needed closure, but not for my sake. She needed it for the cameras. I accepted the call and lifted the phone to my ear. Eilish, darling, Lila's voice floated through the speaker. It was perfectly pitched, carrying the exact practiced frequency of a heartbroken, deeply repentant mother. It was a performance worthy of a television interview. I am so relieved, you finally answered. The silence has been absolutely agonizing for me. I did not respond. I simply listened to the empty space on the line. We have lost everything, Eilish, Lila continued, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. Gregory's career is completely decimated. He is facing decades in federal prison. Victoria is, well, you know exactly where your sister is. The lawyers are taking whatever is left. We are entirely broken. We need to heal as a family. The press is ruthlessly hounding us. If you would just agree to a joint statement, a simple public declaration of forgiveness, we could begin to rebuild our lives. She was not asking for a daughter's forgiveness. She was explicitly asking for a public relations lifeline. She wanted me to leverage my newfound credibility as the heroic whistleblower to miraculously resurrect her completely destroyed social standing. You do not want healing, Lila, I said, my voice completely calm and devoid of any lingering familial attachment. You want a press release. You want to mitigate the immense social damage. How can you be so incredibly cold? Lila gasped, genuinely offended that her manipulation was failing. We are your parents. We gave you a beautiful life. Victoria is your flesh and blood. You cannot simply erase your family. Blood is a sacred bond, Eilish. It is a lifelong obligation. I looked across the greenhouse. I saw Maya, a young woman whose life Victoria had nearly destroyed, carefully helping my brother Leo water a row of delicate ferns. They were smiling. They were safe. Blood is just biology, I replied, my tone possessing the sharp, unyielding edge of a surgeon's scalpel. It is a genetic coincidence. It is not an infinite obligation to suffer your abuse. You chose your political empire over your children. You chose Victoria's horrific secrets over my safety. You made your deliberate choices. Now you must live with the absolute consequences. You will regret this, Lila hissed, the motherly facade instantly vanishing into pure venom. You will be completely alone. I am not alone, I answered quietly. I am finally in good company. I pulled the phone away from my ear, ended the call, and permanently blocked the number. The toxic root was cut. The heavy, complicated burden of the past had finally been severed, leaving behind a profound, expansive sense of peace. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked slowly down the central aisle of the greenhouse. The air was incredibly warm and fragrant, a vibrant testament to the careful, honest work we put into the soil every single day. I stopped a few feet away from the propagation benches, quietly observing the beautiful scene unfolding in front of me. Maya was standing next to Leo, holding a small terracotta pot. She was patiently showing him how to loosen the tightly bound roots of a young fern, before gently transferring it into a larger container. Leo was deeply focused, his small hands happily covered in rich, dark soil. He was not experiencing sensory overload. He was not anxious or frightened. He was completely engaged, learning how to give a living thing exactly what it needed to thrive. Buddy, our loyal golden retriever, was sprawled out on his back beneath the wooden bench, his paws twitching lazily as he dreamed in the afternoon sunlight. Maya looked up and caught me watching them. Her face, once pale and paralyzed by absolute terror in the shadows of my father's estate, was now remarkably bright and fiercely resilient. She had testified against Victoria in federal court. She had faced her abuser with incredible, unyielding courage, knowing she was supported by an entire community of survivors we were actively building here at the sanctuary. She had taken her stolen narrative back. I instinctively reached up with my right hand, my fingers lightly brushing against my collarbone. The severe fracture had fully healed over the past 6 months. It occasionally ached when the coastal weather turned cold and damp, a lingering phantom of the violence I had survived. But it no longer represented victimhood or silent endurance. It was a badge of absolute survival. It was the physical catalyst that had ultimately triggered the complete destruction of Gregory's corrupt political empire. For 22 years, my parents had ruthlessly maintained a flawless public image, cultivating a perfectly manicured garden built entirely on deception, extortion, and human suffering. They believed that power was synonymous with absolute control. But true power does not require you to force things to bloom in the dark under the constant threat of destruction. True power is creating a safe, nurturing environment where growth happens naturally, where vulnerable things are protected rather than exploited. I walked over to the bench, picking up a small metal trowel to join Maya and Leo in their work. My hands were covered in dirt, and I had never felt more perfectly clean. The family I had been born into had tried to bury me. The family I had actively chosen was helping me grow. I looked at the incredible, thriving life surrounding me, finally understanding the profound truth of my grandmother's early lessons. Legacy isn't the blood you inherit. It's the safety you cultivate for others. Have you ever had to cut a toxic root to save your own life? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of surviving and thriving. Thank you for walking this path with me. We were completely free now.